the jobs problem has been solved, or has it? Our next guest is going to discuss that issue with us a bit. We've certainly talked about it on the show before. Nick Buffie is a research assistant with the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and he has written a paper making the case that we still have a weak labor market. So, Nick, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So basically, I mean, I could restate your thesis, but that would be silly because you're right here. You're sitting right next to me. So what is the thesis of your paper here? What is the argument you're making?
Well, my argument is kind of twofold. One thing I'm saying is that we haven't really recovered yet from the 2008 recession. Basically, that a lot of people are saying the labor market has improved tremendously. We're seeing really significant job gains, and we have this really low unemployment rate. Now, my claim is both that the labor market hasn't fully recovered and also that there are biases within the unemployment rate that actually lead it to be lower than we would expect given the weakness of the labor market. The biggest problem with the unemployment rate today is that it only counts people as unemployed if they've searched for a job within the past 4 weeks. Mm-hmm. Now, because there was this huge, tremendous increase in long-term unemployment during the recession, a lot of people stopped searching for work. They became really discouraged with their job prospects, and so they gave up hope of being able to find a job. If you've been searching for a job for over a year and you haven't gotten a call back from anybody, chances are you're going to give up searching for work. And when we try to integrate, when we try to correct for that bias and try to look at people who might have given up searching for work, we see that the labor market is actually a lot weaker than the unemployment rate implies.
So let's talk about that for a second. So a lot of people don't realize that when they read about the unemployment, the top line unemployment figure, 4.6% or whatever it might be, that does not include people who just figure they don't have a chance, so they're not looking anymore. You also hear the argument from the right, particularly people will say, well, there are so many old people now, there are so many baby boomers and retired people, that when we talk about labor force participation and when we talk about the percentage of Americans who are actually working, people get worked up over nothing because they're all, that's because of so many retired people. But this is, in fact, you're looking at numbers for people who are of working age, right?
Right, so that critique about people dropping out of the labor force because they're of retirement age, that's not a completely unfounded or unwarranted critique. That has happened to some degree. But the issue is that you can actually look at, say, for example, prime age workers, so people who are aged 25 to 54, who we typically expect to be working. If you look at those people, their employment rate, so the percentage of people who are actually employed rather than unemployed, that fell about 5 percentage points during the recession. Since then, it's increased about 3 percentage points. But that means we're only about 60% of the way recovered from the recession. Right now, there's about 2.7 million fewer prime age workers than we would expect in the job market right now. Now, that compares to only about 480,000 people who we would expect to be basically who have lost their jobs relative to 2007 based on the unemployment rate. So that should give you an idea of how biased the unemployment rate is, but also the fact that even after you adjust for the aging of the population, that only explains a portion of the overall decrease in employment. It doesn't explain the majority of it.
So what happened? I mean, if we say that, is it that people declared victory too soon? I mean, there was enormous debate, as you know, especially between Republicans and Democrats, and even within the president's administration, how much should we ask for in stimulus money? How much should the federal government move to create jobs? Originally the economist in charge, when President Obama first proposed a stimulus, wanted to propose a much larger stimulus package. She was talked out of it by her boss.
Right.
Then the president went to Congress with a smaller number. It got negotiated. Did people claim victory too soon, and just did we have a? I guess what I'm trying to say is, and are we suffering from a kind of unfortunate condition where, because this top line number looks better than it really is, we don't have the political will to do more to create jobs?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that people declared victory too soon back in, say, 2010 or 2011. I mean, even the biased unemployment rate, even that said we had a very weak economy back in 2010, 2011. My issue is more that they're beginning to declare victory right now. They're saying unemployment is back below 5%. It's at 4.9% right now, which is about where it was in 2007 before the recession. But that doesn't include all these people who have stopped looking for work. And one of the biggest issues where you see people who are beginning to talk about, well, the economy strengthened, we're taking a victory lap, they're talking about raising interest rates at the Federal Reserve. And I think that would be quite problematic given how weak the labor market actually is.
And we've actually talked about that on this show with Dean Baker, who is one of your co-directors and bosses at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. We're talking with Nick Buffie. So do we have a sense of, we have in effect this invisible unemployed workforce. And by invisible, I mean what you're saying, which is that they're not counted in the typical numbers. So we have this invisible force of discouraged workers. Do we know, and in addition to that, we have people who are working part-time who might want to be working, who do want to be working full-time. That's in the so-called U6, I believe it is, unemployment figures. We have people who aren't making the wages they made before. We have all sorts of categories of unemployed and underemployed people who are in some ways invisible in a general policy discussion. Do we have any sense of who they are or where they are, either geographically or in other ways?
Well, we have more of a sense of who they are in terms of demographics. One of the interesting things is that if you look at the rates of discouraged workers or you look at part-time workers, it's basically across every single demographic group. Mm-hmm. You have both men and women have higher rates of involuntary part-time employment than they did before the recession. People of all age groups have higher rates of involuntary part-time employment. You also have more discouraged workers among young workers, middle-aged workers, old workers, both genders. So I went through that in the paper. There isn't, if you break it down by race, gender, and age, you can't really find a single demographic group where we've experienced true recovery in terms of people returning to the sorts of employment rates with good jobs, with good working hours that they had before the recession.
So if you had to rate this ongoing jobs problem, for lack of a better description, and to me that, by the way, that's a fascinating finding, the idea that it's really, the pain is pretty widespread, and it suggests to me, among other things, that may be one of the reasons why people aren't feeling the growth of the economy the way they're being told they should feel it. Right. We had the good statistics from the Census Bureau about 2015. We had about income growth and so on, poverty reduction. We've had the general, people almost feel, I almost get the sense that people are lecturing the American public on how happy they should be about the economy, and right. People just aren't feeling it. And that finding in terms of these invisible, I call them invisible, discouraged workers or and underemployed workers, that suggests to me maybe one of the reasons why people know someone who can't find a job, that this is kind of distributed around the country. What are your thoughts on that? Right.
Well, that actually, I think that there's two things there. One is that the Census Bureau reports that came out earlier last week, actually, that said that there had been income gains for people who are at the lower and kind of middle end of the income distribution. Now, income gains among people who are working is a somewhat different topic than just whether or not you can actually find a job in the first place. A second thing which is important, though, is that the Census Bureau report showed really good gains for 2015. So 2015 was a much better year than 2014. But that doesn't mean that 2015 right. was a much better year than, say, the mid-2000s before the recession. So what the Census Bureau report seemed to indicate more than anything else was that we're recovering. It didn't say that we already have recovered. And I think that that's really the important distinction to make. My data also show that the economy is getting better. I mean, the prime age employment rate, the age-adjusted employment rate, basically all my metrics improved in 2015 relative to 2014, but they're still not where they were relative to 2007. They're only about 2/3 of the way recovered. Which is astonishing when you think about it. And again, we're talking with Nick Buffie of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, because in historical terms, the pace of recovery from the 2008 recession is extraordinarily slow. We're now, and my feeling is, you're welcome to disagree, but my feeling is to be, well, if we're talking about 2015 data, to be 7 years out and still only 2/3 back on a critical indicator like this, to me is a very, very slow process, particularly when we see recessions historically recurring every 7 to 10 years. There's always a possibility we could have another one before we're fully recovered from this one.
Am I off base?
No. In fact, the recovery has been unusually slow. That's for two reasons. One is just the fact that it was a recession that was precipitated by a financial crisis. You typically have slower recoveries after those types of recessions. The other is that we didn't pass a big enough stimulus package. Paul Krugman had done some estimates on his blog, which basically said that the stimulus package should have been twice as big as it actually was. But, the economy hasn't recovered. If you look at the prime age employment rate, it increased about 0.7 percentage points over the past year. And given that we're still down a little bit over 2 percentage points from before the recession, that means we're looking at about 3 more years until we fully recover. So that'd basically say that, the crisis hit originally in 2008. It basically bottomed out in 2010 and 2011, and we're probably not going to recover until 2019. So this has definitely been a long, slow process.
Yeah, with a lot of wealth lost in the meantime. So what would be, I think we all know the answer to this already, but I'll ask you, what would be the right policy response, if you had a majority in both houses of Congress and the presidency, what would you recommend?
Right, if Dean Baker was president of the United States.
Right.
Right. Well, first of all, in terms of the Federal Reserve, which is separate from Congress, I would want to keep interest rates low, and that's one of the big pushes I make in my paper. Right now, there isn't that much hope for fiscal stimulus, just because Congress doesn't really seem that interested in pursuing fiscal stimulus at this point. But I think you could pursue a fairly large fiscal stimulus package for, say, a year or a year and a half. And I think that would be enough to get the economy to fully recover. As of about a year ago, the CBO was estimating that the output gap, that is the difference between potential income and the actual income we're generating right now, was about $500 billion annually. And given what we know about the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus, that implies we should have a fiscal stimulus package on the order of somewhere between $300 and $400 billion, which is much smaller than we had in 2008, 2009, partially because the crisis today isn't as bad as it was back then. We have recovered, like I said, about 2/3, but there's still a significant problem in the economy, and we still need real fiscal stimulus.
No, I think that's a great answer, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And you're referring to the multiplier effect, as they call it. I assume where if you spend $1 of government money, you may get 1.5, depending on what the economy looks like. You'll get more than $1 back in terms of economic growth when that kind of stimulus is needed. So, okay, well, hopefully that will happen. And I do recall that I think it was Christina Romer recommended $1.2 trillion during the height of the crisis, and I think Larry Summers, her boss, said cut that in half. And I think a lot of it was tax cuts too, which may be less effective. I think are less effective than direct spending. So, well, as they say, from your lips to God's ears in terms of that. I don't know that we'll get 300 to 400 billion, but we have infrastructure that needs repairing too, so that would be useful. So Nick Buffie of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, thanks for writing this paper and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me on.